Hey everyone, my name's Brandon Griffin. Thanks for tuning back into the Psychology of Business podcast. Today we have an exciting episode and it's something that we're exploring in a new direction. So, I'm an assistant professor of management, and a lot of my videos and my research and teaching has to do with leadership, it has to do with business, has to do with management. But there are other things on my channel that I've wanted to explore. So, a lot of the things that I'm interested have to do with religious history and specifically Mormon history. And a lot of you probably won't be familiar with Mormon history or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints, but there is a new landmark biography called Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet, published by Professor John G. Turner. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Turner into our virtual studio today.
Hi, Brandon. Great to be with you. Thanks to everyone for listening.
Wonderful. So, Dr. Turner, he's a professor of religious studies and history at George Mason University. And he has published a couple different biographies relating um, to early American history, American religious history. But what I'm interested in a lot of his work has to do with the Latter day Saint movement. So, one of the first books he what I think is the first book he published was on Brigham Young, right? That was your first kind of Mormon book you published, right? It was your Brigham Young biography. And then he did one comparing the Mormon Jesus to the Christian Jesus, what differences between those. And then this came out, was it June or July that this was released?
June of 25.
Wonderful. So this book, Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet, published by Yale University Press. And I have to show you, I had the opportunity of listening to John speak, and I got his autograph in my little book there. So that was at the Compass in Provo this past summer. So
That was a lot of fun. Yeah,
that was a lot of fun, and I'm sure it's been busy with the book coming out. So before we actually dive into some of the history behind Joseph Smith, the Latter day Saint movement, I want to talk about you. So if you look online, on your website, you give a little bio, say that you're a Presbyterian, you got your PhD from Notre Dame, and now you are doing what you're doing now. So how did a Presbyterian who studied at a Catholic university end up focusing on, everything you're researching, but the last couple of years, specifically Mormon history?
well, I'm far less interesting than Joseph Smith, but I'll talk about myself a little bit. So I grew up in something between a mainline and an evangelical Presbyterian congregation. Spent a lot of time in evangelical Protestant spaces in both high school and college. And really, because of my own Christian faith, I got interested in the history of Christianity on my own, and then also as an undergraduate student. And I wanted to, and I loved when I was in college, I just loved my history professors. So I wanted to become one. And I wanted to study some aspect of religion in American history. And I ended up doing my PhD at the University of Notre Dame, which, as you said, is a Catholic university. But there was a great evangelical Protestant historian named George Marsden there. And so I went there to work with him. So it was sort of ironic. He had sort of an evangelical enclave within the Notre Dame history department. More generally, it was a great place to be in graduate school. All of the faculty were totally accessible and encouraging. So it was pretty dreamy. And I didn't study Mormon history as a graduate student. I did have a couple of classmates who are Latter-day Saints, Patrick Mason and Matt Grow. Getting to know them did help get me interested in the tradition. Also, I think if you're studying American religious history, it's hard not to, at some point, take a look at the Latter-day Saint story. In the 19th century in particular, it's actually very revealing about broader trends in not only American religion, but also American politics and westward expansion and conquest. So eventually, I was looking for a new research project. I thought about I thought about researching writing on Mormons and conservative politics in the United States more recently, but I thought I should know something about the history of this movement. So I started reading about the earlier history of the church, took an interest in the figure of Brigham Young, and plunged into that. And I've just maintained an interest in Mormon history since then, partly because I love the community of people who do Mormon history. And I just also love the richness of the sources, that you can get such an readily accessible, intimate view of so many amazing 19th century stories.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So, you talked about the people who do Mormon history, and that brings me into my next question: is Mormonism didn't die out like a lot of other religious movements in the 19th century. It reached a turning point when Joseph Smith was martyred. That there was a succession crisis, and there was a lot of different movements that started out, and some of them have grown and become large. Movements like the modern day Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We have the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ, now known as the Community of Christ. We have a lot of other a lot of other denominations within kind of the Mormon tradition. But if Mormonism didn't currently exist as it exists now, with there is a lively academic and devotional audience consuming and putting out these materials, would you actually still be interested in the story of Joseph Smith? If after 1844 things just kind of fizzled out, would you still be interested in the story of Joseph Smith?
It's a great question. Well, I guess there's no way to know. I will say it's not just that Mormonism or the LDS Church is not a large global movement. It's also a group of people who are unusually interested in their own history. And so it is nice to write about a subject for which there is a built-in audience. So, I mean, that is a calculus. You want people to be interested in what you write. I mean, Adventism is a larger global movement, but I would say there would not be as much popular interest in a biography of Ellen White, one of the key founders of the Seventh-day Adventist movement, as there is in Joseph Smith. So it's also just the assiduous Latter-day Saint interest in their own history that's part of the equation. But could I be interested anyway? Sure. A colorful, fascinating story has inherent appeal. There's a historian named, boy, I hope I get the name of the author correct, named, I think Sean Wilentz wrote a book on a man named Sam Patch, who is a contemporary of Joseph Smith, who at the time became famous or notorious for repeatedly going over Niagara Falls in a barrel, and wrote a whole book on his story. And nobody's heard of Sam Patch who hasn't read that book. So yeah, I could still be interested in him without the larger global movement, but it's an added bonus at least.
Definitely. So, within the broader studies of Mormon studies and starting with the New Mormon history and really going back all the way to Fawn Brody, there have been a couple of big biographies that have come out about Joseph Smith from a more scholarly standpoint. So, in the 1940s, we had Fawn Brody came out with No Man Knows My History. Donna Hill came out with her biography, was the early 70s. We had Richard Bushman. He came out with kind of a book on Joseph Smith, the beginnings of early Mormonism, and he revised that with his 2005 Rough Stone Rolling. We've had Dan Vogel. He's come out with a couple pieces, kind of going over the first start of Joseph Smith's life, and recently he published Charisma Under Pressure. But we've had a couple of biographies come out surrounding Joseph Smith. So this book, Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet, what does your book add to the field, or what unique contributions do you make that haven't been covered in some of those other works?
So great question. Well, first of all, I admire all of the people that you just mentioned, and nobody approaching the early history of Mormonism or Joseph Smith's life is just going to um, start with a blank slate. So the fact that so many people have excavated um, his life in such detail is just enormously helpful. The Joseph Smith Papers Project, um, which, if listeners aren't familiar, is a multi-million dollar effort by the church to publish documents created by or under the direction of Joseph Smith. That project essentially is just wrapping up. And most of those documents were already accessible, but they're now just so carefully annotated and placed in sequence, that made my life a lot easier. I do think, in just a very broad sense, there was space for a biography of Joseph Smith that was neither from a faithful Latter-day Saint perspective or either a former Latter-day Saint perspective or super skeptical perspective. Um, I think also one characteristic of Mormon history is because the field can be contentious. There's a tendency for many authors to write lengthier, almost excessively footnoted books. And one of my goals, and I'm all for that. That is something I like about the field. But one of my goals with this biography was to take this complicated life and commit myself to a not overly long biography that someone who didn't know anything about the story could pick up, understand, and enjoy. So I don't know if that's not exactly like a scholarly contribution to the field, but that I think when you're writing biography, that's often also an important goal.
So I'm looking, including your epilogue, it looks 376 pages is your book. I think Richard Bushman's is 600 plus. Um, might be up there. So yeah, that's definitely accessible. Um, and as we start digging into some of the actual history that I want to ask you, that comes from your book, I want to talk about kind of the field of history in general. So one, I grew up when Joseph Smith Papers Project was really getting off the ground. How impressive is that project? Because it was kind of like, well, the guys up in Salt Lake, they're writing books about all the history. I didn't know if that was truly impressive or not. And they say they've won a lot of awards, but truly, how impressive is that to document stuff like that with the Joseph Smith Papers?
So the Joseph Smith Papers is a documentary editing project.
Hmm.
So, and you could imagine for parallels, there are some famous ones, such as the papers of George Washington or the um, Adams papers, um, the papers of Martin Luther King Jr. So usually the people who get these treatments are political figures. There's also a good, really long-standing project on the papers of Jonathan Edwards. What the church has done for Joseph Smith, I mean, all of these presidents and poets and other preachers, they should just be envious because it's not just a question of finding the papers, transcribing them, and publishing them. It's really the scholarly apparatus that is so impressive. So Joseph Smith in a letter references a number of obscure people in Western Illinois in 1842. I mean, the Joseph Smith Papers team, they will have found out basically what those people had for breakfast that morning. I mean, it's that level of diligence. Um, Also, Joseph Smith found himself engaged in a large number of legal cases over the course of his adult life. Those papers are often, for a single case, there are often bits and pieces of a case in different archives. Um, and the Joseph Smith project essentially created calendars of all of those documents, so you can really trace those cases. Often wrote a lengthy introduction that makes puts everything in the right context. Um, I could go on and on. There's a wealth of sort of mini biographies on not just even the principal people in the Joseph Smith story, but a huge cast of characters. There are great maps. It's enormously useful for a historian. I guess it's making me think I was kind of lazy to write this after the Joseph Smith Papers project.
I've thought about I don't know how good it would be because ChatGPT hallucinates a lot, but if you were to download every single document, throw it in ChatGPT, some type of AI, could it write a biography on Joseph Smith? I've thought, could I write a chapter just throwing in all the documents?
I
Um,
mean,
yeah.
I will just want to assure you, Brandon, that if you took my biography and ran it into an AI text detector, I think I'm in the clear.
All right, good. That's what I
Yeah.
was trying to get to. No, I'm just
Okay.
kidding. All right. So, talking about, we have all the historical documents. We have people who are critical of the movement. We have people who are faithful to the movement. We have your biography, which some people like to say is the first, not like to say, it is kind of the first biography that's written by someone who wasn't directly involved as a believer or not former believer in the movement. So, based on these documents, is there a way that we can look and tell the sincerity of Joseph Smith or the sincerity of people within this movement? If Joseph Smith, writes down in his 1832 history about his first vision, or when we start hearing about golden plates, when we start, talking about some of the actual things that happened revolving around religious claims, can we assess Joseph Smith's or anyone else for that matter sincerity who, lived 200 years ago?
I think in general, assessing sincerity is tricky. It's not an empirical thing. Sometimes we might be able to measure an individual's wealth in 1844, at least create a rough estimate of it, but you can't measure sincerity in that way. Um, but yeah, nevertheless, it's also not something that we can't assess in any way. So I'll just throw out some examples. I don't think Joseph Smith had gold plates engraved with ancient writings. So I don't think he was sincere when he claimed that he did. I reached that conclusion in part because I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the Book of Mormon is not an ancient record. That's a huge topic, but just I think in that case I have some evidence to go on. But often we don't have evidence, or we just can't quite be sure. We don't have conclusive evidence. So did Joseph sincerely think he could translate what he claimed were the writings of the patriarch Abraham? Well, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. It's hard to know for sure. Did Joseph sincerely think that God wanted him to be sealed in marriage to 30-ish women? Maybe. Did Joseph believe that relationships sealed on earth could persist for eternity? I would say probably. I think he did. But sincerity isn't some easily quantifiable thing. Again, it's not empirical. I think sometimes we can use some evidence to point to likely sincerity or insincerity, but I think historians should also be cautious I'd also say that someone acting insincerely in one circumstance is not in and of itself evidence that an individual is just insincere through and through.
Thanks for sharing that. And when I talk about, kind of sincerity, when I do research, I measure something called social desirability, which is this idea of, do I want to present myself in a way that's socially normative or socially appropriate? And you kind of did that too. This interview is going to go public. I made a joke about AI and kind of in a humorous way, but kind of, protecting yourself. He said, I didn't really use AI for this project. So when Joseph Smith was writing down his histories, I'm sure a lot of it, especially at the beginning, he didn't know how far and wide that would be disseminated. But, there's still a chance that he knew that people were going to be looking at this beyond, himself, that what he wrote, in a journal or something was not going to stay there. It's probably going to go and, outside of the binding of that journal. So, I want to switch gears a little bit and start talking about his business and leadership life. So, from the beginning of Joseph Smith's life, and really before then, starting with Joseph Smith Sr., he was involved with business dealings. He had a lot of different business careers, all the way from um, working as a treasure digger and with seer stones in his early life, all the way to buying steamboats, in the end of his life, and everything in between. So, could you give us a general overview of Joseph Smith, the businessman? Was he successful? And kind of the business side of Joseph Smith.
That's such a huge question.
Yeah.
So for listeners who aren't familiar with his story, Joseph Smith came from super modest, humble, destitute circumstances. His family was downwardly mobile. He did not have any clear economic prospects as a young man. When he was in his um, late teens, and when he was in his late teens, he essentially worked as a day laborer. You might get at most 50 cents a day for, agricultural labor. He then got paid, according to his own statement, $14 a month to lead a treasure digging expedition along the Susquehanna, along the New York, Pennsylvania border. And then he was engaged, as your question indicated, in all sorts of business activities. He sold books. He bought and sold land. He helped establish a bank. And he started a number of merchandising operations. He opened a store in Nauvoo, Illinois, and worked behind the counter, at least for a day. So, yeah, this is a long and complicated career. In terms of success, I'd say the single most successful thing that Joseph Smith did was to acquire land and then establish communities that led to a rapid rise in the value of that land. So that happened repeatedly in Kirtland, Ohio, and then especially in Nauvoo, Illinois. I think of him more successful as the founder of communities rather than being especially successful in business per se. So his merchandising operations, they usually weren't super successful for a variety of reasons. He would sometimes take on too much debt in acquiring goods. He would extend too much credit to church members who didn't have a lot of money to pay for things. The bank that he and his associates established, I mean, it basically collapsed within a few weeks. So that's not super successful. as, sort of his first almost semi significant business proposition was the Book of Mormon itself. And let's face it, long term distribution in terms of numbers is extremely impressive, but the initial sales weren't really good. So, a lot of Joseph's business ideas didn't really work out. But I almost think that's not the best way of judging them, because some of these things were designed to make money, but they were also designed to catalyze a movement, attract people to new places. And in those respects, his activities were eminently successful.
Definitely. And a lot of people say that a lot of people critical to Joseph Smith say that Joseph Smith was just in the religion building business for money, sex, and power. And they especially get to that conclusion, when you reach Nauvoo and there seems to be, more issues relating to that. But when Joseph Smith started out, when he was digging wells for Josiah Stoll and leading some of those expeditions there and when he started the Book of Mormon project, do you think he was in it for, the financial aspect of it, or is there something more to it?
There was something more to it from the start. I do think he also hoped that it would make money.
Hmm.
As of 1827, he didn't have a clear economic path. He didn't want to spend his life farming, probably unsuccessfully, as his parents had in recent years. And I think he did genuinely think the Book of Mormon was going to sell and be profitable. That's a terrible idea in terms of a money-making scheme. Not a lot of first-time authors, pull that off. In fact, historically, most eminent authors don't make a lot of money from their books. So yeah, from the start, he definitely had non pecuniary purposes. He absolutely had a theological and spiritual vision that he articulated in the Book of Mormon. And the Book of Mormon turned out to be actually a really good vehicle for those ideas. I think it would have been far more customary to simply start a church and to go around preaching and attracting followers that way, and maybe starting a cheap newspaper, which the church eventually does. But the Book of Mormon was a much more original and splashy way to put one's ideas into circulation. And it attracted far more notice than would have been the case had Joseph simply sort of itinerated the way a lot of upstart religious leaders would have done.
So if he would have followed the way that religious leaders were at the time, probably would have started a small church, and that slowly would have grown over time. But Joseph Smith, having this tangible artifact that he published in the Book of Mormon, was that the vehicle for conversion to what was then known as the Church of Christ? Or was it Joseph Smith, the charismatic leader, who converted people to the movement?
Well, I don't know if I can quantify that, or I don't think I can quantify that. But I think at first it was more the book. I mean, most people who um, converted, um, say in the 1830s, they did so, and beyond, they did so without meeting Joseph Smith. So they would encounter missionaries who would sell or often just give them a copy of the Book of Mormon. Sometimes reading the Book of Mormon was the instrument of people's conversion. Sometimes it was, maybe if you weren't such a diehard reader, it would be just an encounter with the missionaries who would tell you this story, and you might believe it without reading the book from cover to cover. Um, I think it wasn't uncommon for people to convert or sort of at least mostly convert and then want to come and meet Joseph Smith as a way of sort of sealing the deal. Or after converting and joining the church, maybe eventually go meet Joseph Smith to kind of see what you got yourself into. Brigham Young did that about half a year after his baptism, so that also wasn't uncommon. But I would say more the book than Joseph's personal charisma.
Hmm. So you mentioned Brigham Young. I think he sat on the Book of Mormon for a year, 2 years, but it was ultimately the spiritual gifts exhibited by missionaries that brought him into the fold. Right? It was the speaking in tongues of missionaries and the Book of Mormon before even meeting Joseph Smith that brought him in. Is that correct?
That's correct. So yeah, he acquired a Book of Mormon, I think the year of its publication in 1830. But then a couple of years later, almost 2 years later, as he was still contemplating this new movement, he, I think his brother and a friend went to Pennsylvania to visit with a group of elders. And they saw those men speak in tongues. And so for him, that was proof positive of the power of God within this new church. That also is not an unusual, it's not actually really an unusual conversion story, not always speaking in tongues, but oftentimes um, people would report miraculous healings, exorcisms, other remarkable experiences uh, in their encounters with missionaries. Um, and for a good number of converts, latter day miracles were conclusive.
Yeah. So after Joseph Smith publishes the Book of Mormon, um, he eventually leaves New York and goes to Kirtland, Ohio. And one thing that's unique about Joseph Smith that you touched on is that he was so great at building communities. So, why did Joseph Smith try to gather these people into one giant community? And how successful was he in Kirtland at doing that?
So, yeah, it's a great question. In terms of the ultimate why, that's not actually easy to answer. But one of the things that Joseph Smith did was dictate revelations, essentially messages in the words of Jesus Christ. So, divine commandments for his followers. And in the fall of 1830, there are a series of revelations that um, indicate that his followers are going to gather to a new Jerusalem, a new city of Zion that they will build among the Lamanites. So, in the vicinity of Native Americans. And it becomes apparent that this is going to be in Western Missouri. At about the same time, though, so that's the theological rationale for a gathering. But at about the same time, are there's a large number of converts to the church in northeastern Ohio, and Joseph relocates there early in 1831, and that becomes his center of operations for the next 6 years or so. And so, for a stretch of time in the 1830s, you have hundreds of church members gathering to both Missouri and to northeastern Ohio. And Joseph doesn't want them just to show up and sort of do their own thing. He wants them to gather for a purpose, to be united, to be of one heart and mind, to work on common projects like building a house of the Lord, building a temple, um, finding ways to provide for the poor, welcoming newcomers. And so, to that end, um, he asks his revelations direct his followers to consecrate their wealth to the church, and for church leaders to use those funds for those purposes. That proves really difficult to implement. But I think, at its core, that's the vision of people of one heart and mind, who ultimately, um, in Missouri, are going to build um, a new Jerusalem to which Christ will imminently return.
And how is that idea administered? I know you said the dictates come from the revelations, but did it all come back to Joseph Smith? Was there some type of organizational structure that um, was formed in the church? Today we have regional authorities, we have local congregation authorities, but it all kind of goes back to a central corporation in Salt Lake City. But um, in Kirtland and beyond, did Joseph Smith build some type of organizational structure to manage the building and the gathering of Zion?
Yeah, so he established um, what he and his associates called the United Order. I can't remember how many principal men were involved, maybe six, seven, or eight. And the idea was to bring together um, a number of the church's business operations under that umbrella. So those included a printing press, um, the acquisition and distribution of land, a merchandising operation, and the hope was that these operations would, provide for the living expenses of the men involved, and then profits could be used for various church needs. There really weren't any profits to speak of, so that was
Uh,
sort of, sort of not relevant. Um, and I think um, one challenge that Joseph's decisions created during these years was it was a real impediment to have two centers of operation in one in Missouri, one in northeastern Ohio, 1,000 miles apart. Much harder to direct than it would be in 2025. But it took a long time for information to flow back and forth or for decisions to be made. And people living apart had a hard time staying united and of common purpose.
mhm. And beyond that, he also established an ecclesiastical structure, correct? So be
Correct.
yeah.
And this is I mean, this is during his whole lifetime. It's a new movement, and um, Joseph, he he did spend actually a lot of energy. Um, I guess you could say trying to perfect church government to create different layers of authority to sort of give a large number of people, large number of men, um, some significant positions within the movement. He tended to introduce a lot of different layers of authority. The lines between them weren't always clear, so that was also a bit of a constant challenge.
Mhm. And how with the United Order, but really this ecclesiastical structure that he built with different layers and giving people power below him, but ultimately retaining um, the ultimate power. Was that different from a lot of religious leaders at the time? Was there one central person, and when that person died or went away, the movement kind of shattered? How different was Joseph Smith in that aspect compared to other contemporaries?
So that's a great question. So I would say there are a lot of analogies to the organization of um, the Methodist movement that emerged out of the Church of England. In a couple of respects, like the Methodists, um, the early Mormons adopted the habit of holding regular conferences, either quarterly or semi-annually. And those are still an important aspect of the contemporary Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Also from the Methodists, the significance of something akin to an itinerant ministry during the early years was also significant. At the same time, and I would say that even within early Methodism, individual leaders often exercise a great um, degree of authority, starting with John Wesley, but then in the early 19th century United States, Francis Asbury. So Methodism could also be hierarchical and authoritarian, while at the same time having almost a democratic sense of creating lots of layers of authority and empowering large numbers of individuals. I think there's some really distinctive things about what Joseph Smith did. First, both the language and the concept of priesthood was foreign to American Protestantism as a whole. It hearkened back to um, the Old Testament and the priests of ancient Israel. I think in the minds of many American Protestants, it also smacked of Catholicism, although without, the at least in normal circumstances, without the priestly garments and things like that. And then, for Joseph Smith is recognized as not just president of the high priesthood, but also as prophet, seer, translator, and revelator. So, from the start, Joseph, stakes a claim to, let's say, a remarkable constellation of both spiritual gifts and also authority.
Hmm. And if I take a step back, or yeah, step back a little bit, as preparing for this conversation, something that I'm trying to balance when talking about kind of the academic study of Joseph Smith and the more devotional side of Joseph Smith is, how much of his ideas came from the environment around him, how much came from inspiration from God, if any. It's as a member of the church today myself versus looking at things from a more academic perspective. It's balancing, where did it come from, and trying to be respectful, and me trying to do this in kind of like an academic business sense. How do we do that, which may even be easier for a historian like you to draw on the parallels that exist in the surrounding environment. But it was interesting what you said, going back to the Methodists, is when Joseph Smith was translating the Book of Mormon and he lost a significant portion of the manuscript. We kind of call that the lost 116 pages episode. What I like to call, he had a faith crisis of um and he went back to the Methodist movement. He thought all was lost. So it's interesting that that continued on beyond that moment. I think there's a quote that said he was, partial to the Methodist sect, or they're the closest to truth behind us. In essence, what they're trying to say. Um,
I
Beyond
think
that.
that's partly because he also disliked the Presbyterians so much. So the Methodists seemed, relatively better.
Mhm.
And, his wife, Emma, had a background in Methodism. Yeah, I do think it is sort of funny or interesting that I think religious believers, and I put myself in that category as well, we like to think that the most distinctive things about our traditions, they somehow, we feel better about them if we think that they sort of come directly from God. That sort of heightens the authority. And I think the reality is that most religious innovators, they're drawing on what's around them and they are reformulating it in creative ways. And I actually think Latter-day Saints, not that I'm here to give theological advice to Latter-day Saints, but I think that they actually have a theological rationale for buying into that is okay. So as a so most Christians, at least over the last, I don't know, 18 centuries or so, have believed that God created the world out of nothing. And I think even for a lot of Christians who aren't very into theology, th- they if at least if asked, they would affirm that. Joseph Smith taught that that wasn't the case, that matter was eternal, and that um, God, you could say in a way, organized that matter in new and creative ways. I think a lot of people like the idea of revelation out of nothing rather than revelation out of, existing stuff. But I think it usually is revelation out of existing stuff. And for me, that doesn't, I don't see why that would have to invalidate things or make them less worthy of respect.
Hmm. So this idea you're talking about of creating, something out of pre-existing material, this idea of creation ex nihilo. Am I saying that right?
I think so.
Um, yeah, that's definitely built into the theology of Latter-day Saints of building things line upon line, precept upon precept. In the Doctrine and Covenants, kind of a distinctive feature of Mormonism is that a lot of adherents don't drink alcohol, don't drink coffee, don't drink tea, don't smoke, don't do things, and that's called the Word of Wisdom. And the Word of Wisdom initially came from a complaint from Joseph Smith's wife, Emma Smith, because the story goes she was sick of cleaning up tobacco spit off the ground. And when Joseph Smith inquired of the Lord about it, he was given a revelation about not to drink hot meats, to eat meat sparingly, to, um, you know, what is it? Alcohol is not for the belly, but for the body. And that came from, it didn't come from nowhere. First, it started because of a question from Emma Smith, but what a lot of things we don't talk about in the devotional context is that was kind of the common medical advice of the day, right? While yes, a lot of people were drinking, even Joseph Smith's family, Joseph Smith Sr. was, by today's standards, a heavy drinker. There was kind of this greater movement of health codes that existed in the environment. So, it was prodded by Emma Smith, but also followed up by what existed in the environment already.
Yeah, I mean, it's the sort of early years of the temperance movement. And part of that context was it wasn't just Joseph Smith Sr. There are statistics that document that because of an ability to cheaply transport whiskey really over the Appalachian Mountains, American men started drinking much larger amounts of hard liquor in the 1820s. So there's a bit of a cultural crisis surrounding the use of alcohol, and the Word of Wisdom, I think, in part responds to that. And then there are other health movements that really urge people to abstain from any form of stimulant. Um, and so that has tobacco and coffee and tea folded into it.
Hmm. So going back to our kind of business conversation, Joseph Smith, he did a lot of things in Ohio and eventually gets the movement to move to Jackson County, Missouri. And in Jackson County, the creation of the New Jerusalem, he's there for a few years, but it seems like things really start to turn up a notch when the movement ends up in Nauvoo. Can you tell us some of the things that kind of happened leading into Nauvoo. Joseph Smith in Liberty Jail, Joseph Smith, from Liberty Jail, directing people to go to Commerce, Illinois, which was later renamed Nauvoo. What happened there that kind of, you know, was so interesting about the Nauvoo period? Because it seems like there's a real difference between the early Joseph Smith versus what a lot of Latter-day Saints a lot of historians call Nauvoo doctrine or the Nauvoo period.
Sure. So, in 1838, there is what I would just describe as a brief war between Mormons and non-Mormons in Western Missouri. Uh, Things get to a point um, at which the governor of Missouri issues an order commanding the Mormons to leave the state or face execution, face extermination. That's the word, um, which is just remarkable. I mean, think about that: the governor of a state issuing an extermination order um, against the members of a particular church or religious tradition. At first, Joseph directs his people to organize themselves to fight back. They do even undertake some offensive operations against the mobs that are harassing them, but they're outnumbered. And Joseph ultimately surrenders. And when he does, he and some of his associates are incarcerated. He's facing charges of treason. He spends about 4 months in a squalid um, jail in Liberty, Missouri. I think he's very much scarred by that experience. Not even just the incarceration so much as the fact that mobs can organize, and this had happened previously in other parts of Missouri, but that mobs can organize and drive people off of their land, force them away with no compensation, and sometimes enduring unimaginable horrors of being beaten or being raped, being pillaged. One can't overstate just how wrenching this is for the Mormon people more broadly, but also specifically for Joseph Smith. So the Mormons leave Missouri. Smith is eventually allowed to escape before he really faces trial on the treason and murder charges. And he and his people regroup and purchase land at first on both sides of the Mississippi River in Iowa and Illinois, but most significantly in a city in Illinois that they renamed Nauvoo, which was rough Hebrew for a beautiful place. So one of Smith's goals is simply his overriding goal in many ways is just for what happened in Missouri to not happen in Illinois. Ultimately, it does. Yeah, he can't stave it off because the basic problem is that non-Mormons become alarmed and oppositional when you have thousands of church members gathering in a single place and becoming an economic and political force. But Smith tries to stave it off in a few ways. One, he seeks political alliances, first and foremost with the Democratic Party in Illinois. He also establishes a large militia named the Nauvoo Legion. I don't know, 3,000 Latter-day Saint men. And these sort of defensive measures in the eyes of non-Mormons are actually rather provocative, and in the end lead to a lot of opposition and renewed mob activity.
So Joseph Smith, he brings all these people to Nauvoo, Illinois, and it creates a city that rivals Chicago in size. It's positioned well on the Missouri River, and there's a lot of allegations and evidence for polygamy. They're starting to have significant influence when we talk about, political issues and dealing with that. And ultimately, they or let me ask this question. Was Joseph Smith trying to forge out his own empire? Did he want to remain as a part of the United States at this point? I know there were a lot of, hard feelings with land that he felt like was stolen in Jackson County, Missouri. Or was he looking to expand beyond and kind of alienate himself from the broader United States and live, kind of under his own jurisdiction?
So Joseph sees what happened in Missouri as a violation of American principles. And one of his complaints is that the American constitutional order, at least in the way that it's lived out, is deficient in that there's no use of federal national authority to protect minorities from mobs, essentially, that the state of Missouri failed to act to protect his people. And the national government essentially says none of our business. When he leaves Missouri, Joseph doesn't really give up, I think, on the United States. There are movements to petition Congress for redress. Um, Even after those essentially fall on deaf ears in Washington, I still don't think he's actually ready to wash his hands of the United States. Um, into the last several months of his life, he is trying to really find a way to work with national authority rather than against it. He also launches this, quixotic and somewhat absurd campaign for the presidency in 1844, mainly because none of the other leading candidates promised to support his people's rights. So there is a sense of growing frustration and alienation from the U.S., sharper criticism of the U.S. Constitution as inadequate, and a suggestion that Joseph stands at the head of the kingdom of God on earth that will eventually supplant not just the United States, but other nations. I think this is mostly thinking in future terms rather than, um, certainly rather than leading some treasonous operation against the country. I think had he not been murdered in 1844, Joseph's ultimate next move probably would have resembled Brigham Young's in the sense of trying to find a new refuge for his people where they could gather and grow with less external interference.
Hmm. I've skipped over kind of a lot of topics I want to talk about, but I know you don't have all day to talk, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds because I'm trying to provide an overview here. But Joseph Smith, he translated the Book of Mormon in 1830. He starts this movement that goes from northeastern Ohio to western Missouri to Nauvoo, and ultimately he is martyred or murdered, and we get into this era of Brigham Young. But before I do that, the Joseph Smith made a lot of honestly bad business dealings sometimes. He made a lot of mistakes. He lost a lot of people's money. He wasn't the greatest businessman out there, but he created something powerful. Like I said, the city of Nauvoo at the time of his death rivaled the city of Chicago. So why do you think his followers stayed loyal to him after financial, other organizational failures? Was it, the message of the restoration? Was it his charisma? Was it something else? Why did people stay with Joseph Smith, as a leader?
It's a great question. I don't know if there is an sort of combined answer to that. I mean, I think that's it's deeply individual for different people. I think we also have to reckon with the fact that at different points, even people who had been really close to Joseph Smith broke with him and rejected his leadership. Um, and so both sticking with him through thick and thin and abandoning him after perhaps a last straw, those were both sort of common individual experiences. I would say, again, I do think there is something about a charismatic bond between a leader and followers that can persist through setbacks and failure. And I think sometimes when we talk about charisma, we think, well, that's just, somebody's magnetism or somebody's ability to speak well. But I think what we really mean by charisma is the forging of that bond. Um, when a leader can draw people into a new story, a new life, a new way of living. And I do think people who see themselves as part of that new story and choose to become part of it, that can be a really durable bond. Um, I also think that, um, yeah, the basic message of the restoration that this is Christ's true church. Um, if for people who knew their Bible, and most of Joseph Smith's followers would be in that category, encountering persecution and setbacks is not an unusual thing for human beings. Certainly not an unusual thing for either the ancient Israelites or early Christians. And in fact, Jesus in the New Testament doesn't tell his followers that if you follow me, you're going to have a cushy life and everything's going to go well for you. So I think there were a lot of theological resources that his people could draw on. And then also, I think for when we get into the Nauvoo time period, Joseph's theology, he really fleshes it out during these years. I think since the early 1830s, he's talked about the potential for humans to imitate Christ in terms of achieving the fullness of divine glory and power. One question that Joseph left open for many years was how? How could humans do that? And in particular, how could they do it collectively rather than individually? And Joseph starts answering those questions in Nauvoo. He introduces the ritual of baptism for the dead, in which church members are baptized again on behalf of an ancestor. People respond to that. It's a really new thing on the American religious landscape. Joseph's followers, of all the things he introduces in his life, they really take to that, which is interesting. And then Joseph has been teaching since the mid 1830s that marriage between Christians can persist not just until death parts a couple, but for eternity. And he introduces rituals. He introduces a ritual that seals couples for time and eternity in Nauvoo as well. And Joseph also begins teaching that righteous men have the privilege and indeed the obligation to be sealed to multiple women. Now, that's way more controversial than baptism for the dead. And, I think partly, tears the church apart during the last year of Joseph's life. But for those who stuck with Joseph, there were strong bonds of loyalty, but also strong theological motivations to do so.
Hmm. I was going to go into the connection between Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, but we don't have time sufficiently to do that. Um, so to end, I kind of want to end on a little bit more discussion on you as an individual. But to close up, are there any leadership lessons, business lessons, positive or negative, that you think people should take from Joseph Smith?
Don't marry the wives of your associates. Seriously, that's a really bad idea. But and I'm not just joking about that. Um, but I would say also that, sort of as I already alluded to, failure actually can be okay. That leadership can survive failure. That big ideas can inspire people. And I would also say, whether or not it's good for organizational leadership, I think one other lesson from Joseph Smith's life that he could have paid more attention to was, don't run your followers into the ground. The time horizon might be longer than you think, and so sometimes you need to be a little gentler on people.
Hmm. Well, before I get into specific questions about John and his profession, we're going to close up kind of this segment on Joseph Smith and go out and buy Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet by Dr. John G. Turner. One thing I was wondering is, um, as a author, obviously you're not in it for the financial gains. I don't know if you are, but I imagine you're not in the publishing business for making, a ton of money. But is it more beneficial for you to buy a physical copy, for an ebook copy? If someone wants to support you in the best way that they can, because I read a lot more books digitally, and I don't know if it's broken down to you like that, but do you know what's what's most beneficial for you?
I don't really know. It might actually be the audiobook.
Really?
Um, but honestly, I don't care. I would love it if you're listening and this sounds intriguing. I don't care how you read my book. Get it from your local library. Um, so yeah, I love it. I love talking with people about this kind of stuff. So I'm just happy if anybody reads and hopefully takes some pleasure in it.
Hmm. So that ties me into my last question. I want to understand more about why people do what they do. So you said you want people to read your book. You don't care if they get it from their local library. So maybe going back to when you were, I can't remember if you said high school or early college days. Why are you a historian? Why do you do what you do? Why do you do? Yeah, why do you do what you do?
Yeah. Well, I love history in the sense of figuring out change over time and realizing that people in different times and places really do view the world in fundamentally different ways. So for me, history is a way of expanding my own bandwidth about the world and enjoying and appreciating just the remarkable diversity of human experience. So for me, that's just pleasurable. I love I well, I love writing. It's sort of the only creative thing that I'm any good at all. I can't make music, I can't dance, I can't do art. Um but writing is something that I can do, that I take pleasure in. I like um not just documenting historical events, but I like trying to create and perfect a narrative and playing around with language. I also like teaching. Some days in the classroom go better than others, but when it goes well, it's so intensely gratifying to see other people taking an interest in something that interests me, or just taking some new interest in parts of the world that they might not have been exposed to.
Hmm. And what do you hope your legacy will be? You've published some impressive books, you've done some impressive things in your career, but what do you hope your legacy will be?
Well, I'm not expecting much, Brandon. I think, and I'm just, this is not in any way like excessively dour, but most books, they're totally forgotten, and that's totally okay. I think they're still totally worthwhile, both for the pleasure they give me and sometimes others. But in terms of legacy, I'm banking on my daughter and hoping for future grandchildren and things like that. I think that's the better way to think about it.
Hmm. Wonderful. So I share a lot of those same feelings when it comes to research and teaching and everything, but you definitely are. I don't know about you as a dancer, you as an artist, but you do have a way with writing and everything. So it's nice to hear, why you do history, that you actually enjoy it, that you enjoy, letting it broaden your horizons and, make you a better person. Is there anything you'd like to end on about Joseph Smith, about the study of history, about anything else before we close today?
I mean, I think one of the things that's really fun about um, Joseph Smith and early Mormonism is there's sort of a paradox. It's super well documented. We have thousands of documents that shed light on Joseph Smith and his life. And yet, there are a lot of questions that are hard to answer because well, we never have as much evidence as we like. We only have the record that exists is just a small fraction of what happened. And so for key moments in Joseph Smith's life, there's mystery and uncertainty. And I think that makes it fun. And I also think this is a fun little historical niche because people care so passionately about it from different sides. And that means that sometimes there's heated discussion about golden plates or polygamy or what have you. And yet, everyone who takes like a serious interest in history has to look at the same evidence. They don't have to reach the same conclusions about it, but there is this body of evidence out there, and it is a common ground for people of different backgrounds, ideologies, opinions. And that's one of the other things I love about history. That's why I love one of the things I love about academia in general. It's not often thought of that way. I think, particularly in our sort of polarized contemporary culture. But if we want it, there's a lot of common ground that's available to us in academic settings, or sometimes in other settings where people come together to examine the past. I really like that. I think everybody should lean into that.
Hmm. And that's one thing I'm trying to do is I'm trying to extend beyond, I'm a business professor. I'm interviewing a history professor on something I find personally interesting, but I'm trying to, expand, what I'm doing. But Dr. John Turner, I'd like to thank you for coming on my channel today. Everyone go order the audiobook version, not the other versions. I think you said the audiobook of
Yeah,
Joseph
I
Smith,
said any version. So,
any version. Joseph Smith, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet. He also wrote Brigham Young, Pioneer Prophet. And it looks like I'm cheating. I'm on your website. You've written books on the Plymouth Colony. What else? What other works do you want to
I
promote right
I
now?
wrote a history of sort of late 20th century American evangelicalism.
Awesome. All right, Dr. Turner, thank you so much. Everyone, thank you so much for watching, listening, tuning in. But you have a great day. Happy learning. I'll see you next time.